Hey guys, winter has come to Florida. Yep, it's only 65 degrees outside right now. Brrr. Anyway, we need to get this car ready for boost. Now in the previous video we did some oil system upgrades, and we also put a new set of rod bearings in the engine. In this video we're going to do one more oil system upgrade, and it's a big one. Yep, we're installing an M3 oil filter housing and an oil cooler. Okay, so I have to admit, this was sort of an impulse thing. But anyway, I got the M3 oil filter housing off of eBay. It came off of a E46 M3 that was parted out. Now, when it came to me, it still had the oil filter in it, and there was still some oil in there, and oh boy was it nasty. So yeah, I think we understand how this came to be available on eBay. Apparently the owner of that M3 didn't take very good care of their car. But their loss is my gain. Anyway, let's get started. Okay, so off camera we got the M3 oil filter housing all cleaned up. It's not perfect, but it's a definite improvement. Okay, so before we get started, let me show you all the things I'm going to be using in this oil filter housing swap. Now, of course, we're going to be using the oil filter housing from a E46 M3, but it's not a direct bolt-in. It will bolt to the block, but some things like the power steering pump and the Vanos line and stuff are going to need some adaptation. Speaking of which, here is a custom banjo bolt for the Vanos line that should allow me to connect my stock Vanos line to that. Also, the M3 oil filter housing only has provisions for one sensor. This is the oil pressure sensor. The M54 also has an oil temperature sensor. Unfortunately, there's no place on here to put that. So I decided to use this guy. This actually goes into the bottom of the oil pan where the oil level sensor goes. I'm not using the oil level sensor, so I'm going to install this instead. And I can put the oil temperature sensor right in there. For the power steering pump, we have a set of spacers that will go between the pump and the oil filter housing, so hopefully this will space the oil pump correctly. And last but not least, we have the oil cooler. And it came with an adapter that allows it to connect to the oil filter housing. Oh, and just a side note, I'm going to be using these AN adapters that came with the eBay oil cooler kit. Now, there's an issue with this that I think I should mention. They come with O-rings, and the O-rings are the wrong size. They're too big. So they fit too loose onto the fittings here, and they're also too big to fit into the O-ring grooves on the oil filter housing. So these go in the bin, and we're going to use stock replacement O-rings for these fittings. Okay, some of you might get a laugh out of this, but I had to compress the little shock absorber in the belt tensioner somehow, and the hydraulic press was convenient, and actually it worked. So, yeah, let's get this little guy installed, and we'll put that on the oil filter housing, and we'll be good to go. Oh, and we can't forget the oil filter housing gasket. This one is made by L-Ring. Oh, by the way, the tensioner pulley that came with this oil filter housing, listen to this. Yeah, those bearings don't sound very happy. So I think I'm gonna replace this. Okay, so off camera, I cleaned up the oil filter housing with Super Clean. Now, they're not a sponsor, but they do provide free cleaning supplies to the channel, and I do appreciate that, so thank you. And the Super Clean did a pretty good job on that oil filter housing. So, yeah, I think she's ready to install. But of course, before we can install this one, the other one has to come out. Okay, so to make some room to get at the oil filter housing, we're going to remove this intake stuff. I'm also going to detach the power steering reservoir. We also need to detach the alternator and the power steering pump. Since we're messing with the alternator, I'm going to disconnect the battery, just to be safe. Okay, before I forget, we also need to remove the serpentine belt because the tensioner is attached to the oil filter housing. Okay, while I'm in here, I might as well remove the tensioner, and actually I think that one idler pulley bolt also helps to hold the alternator, so that bolt has to come out anyway. Okay, and the tensioner has two bolts, one on the top right there, and one on the bottom, which we can't see, but it's down here somewhere. So, I wonder what happened there. Actually, I wonder if I can get this thing out of here. Alright, there's the one bolt. And there's the bottom bolt. And part of the oil filter housing. Interesting. Okay, so apparently there was a crack in the oil filter housing and it finally let go. I guess it's a good thing I'm replacing it, eh? Okay, since we're in here, we may as well remove the alternator. Once again, I already disconnected the battery for safety, but we have two electrical connections. We have this one, which just unclips, and then we have the big cable right here. I don't know if you can see it, but it connects right there. And there are two mounting bolts. One of them we removed already when we removed the idler pulley. If I can get a camera angle on it. Oh, there we go, right there. And the second bolt is right down there. Okay, here's a closer look at those two electrical connections. The one connection is just squeeze on the tab and you pull it loose. The other one, for the big battery cable, takes a 17mm wrench. Okay, we're making good progress. I think next we will remove the power steering pump, or rather just detach it. If I remember correctly, it's got 3 bolts. Of course, you have this one here, we have that one up there, and there should be another one way down on the bottom. Oh, and we can't forget to unplug the oil temperature and oil pressure sensor fittings. There's one of them, and then the other one is back in here somewhere. Okay, so I jacked up the car and I removed the splash guard from under the engine to get at that bottom power steering pump bolt, and then I realized that third bolt is actually right here. So I didn't need to jack up the car after all. Oh well. Oh, and just FYI, I don't think I mentioned this already, but I'm detaching the pump and just moving it off to the side because I don't want to drain and refill the power steering system. Also, to give myself a little bit more room to work, I detached the evap solenoid from the intake manifold, and I'm just going to move it over to the side. So, I think we've got everything detached. We've got the power steering reservoir out of the way, power steering pump is out of the way, and of course the alternator is out of the way. We should be able to pull that oil filter housing now. Oh, one more thing. Or actually two more things. First of all, we need to disconnect the Vanos line. And also, I'm going to remove the cap from the oil filter housing to let the oil drain back into the engine block. Oh, and by the way, I've got a drain pan under the car to catch any fluids that might leak out. Okay, so according to Real OEM, the pulley on my original tensioner should be the same as the pulley on the M3 tensioner, but yeah, I don't think so. I guess I'll be buying a new tensioner pulley. Okay, now we should be ready to remove the oil filter housing. Now, if I remember correctly, there are a total of 5 bolts. Oh, and here I go knocking stuff over. If I remember correctly, there should be 5 bolts. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay, all the bolts are out. Let's see if that thing comes out. Oh, duh. I missed a bolt. Okay, since we have both oil filter housings here, let's take a look at them. Of course, this one is the M3 unit, and this one is the M54 unit that just came out of my car. Now, there are some differences that are pretty obvious. For example, the M3 has the metal cap, whereas the M54 is plastic. Also, the M3 has the oil cooler attachment, whereas the M54 does not. The M3 unit has a hydraulic tensioner, whereas my car was an earlier model with the spring-loaded tensioner. Also, one thing to note, the M54 has the oil temperature sensor right here, but the M3 does not have a provision for an oil temperature sensor. And that's actually why I got this piece that goes into the bottom of the oil pan. The oil temperature sensor will go right in there. Oh, and by the way, if you're wondering what this is an adapter that I installed in here so I can put a sender unit for my aftermarket oil pressure gauge. Okay, one last thing. If you look closely, you may notice that this part, where the power steering pump attaches to, sticks out a little bit more on the M54 unit than it does on the M3 unit. And that's what these little spacers are for. These go right here, and they should space out the power steering pump so that it lines up. Oh, and one last thing I almost forgot. Apparently the M3 does not have a Vanos oil line, whereas the M54 obviously does. It connects to the back of the oil filter housing right here. Now the M3 unit does have a plug here, which I'm assuming we need to remove so that we can attach the Vanos line there. And to do that, we're going to be using this adapter bolt that I bought, which I think is made just for that purpose. Okay, so with all that said, I want to do two things before I install this in the car. Of course, I want to install the Vanos line with that special bolt there. I also want to transfer over my sender unit and the adapter for my oil pressure gauge. It'll go right there. Oh, by the way, I had to play around with different size washers to get this adapter thing to index properly, so the sender isn't interfering with anything. Okay, now I'm going to put all the mounting hardware in my Redneck parts washer. Ding! Don't say it. Okay, so I got these bolts cleaned up and put a light coat of grease on them to help prevent future rust. Okay, now let's talk about mounting that power steering pump. Like I talked about earlier, we have these spacers that we're going to install here to make up the difference in length between this and this. But unfortunately, there's more to the story. If you look at this mounting bolt, you see it comes in from the back. But on the M3 housing, that bolt hole for this bolt does not go all the way through the bolt that comes in from this way. So I need to make a decision. Do I want to drill that hole all the way through so that bolt can come in like it does here? Or do I want to modify that bracket so I can run a bolt through this way? Now keep in mind the power steering pulley is right about here, so that bolt head cannot stick out. It'll hit the pulley. So if I decide to run a bolt in this way, I'm going to have to countersink this hole and use a bolt that will sit flush. Also, the power steering pump has this bracket on the back which attaches to this mounting point right here. Now unfortunately, the M3 housing does not have a mounting point there. So we're going to have to make a custom bracket. Now I'm thinking about making a small bracket that actually goes from that bolt hole down to the power steering pump. So with that in mind, I'm leaning more towards the drill this thing out all the way tactic. Oh, and I'm not sure if I mentioned this already, but my car has the LF20 power steering pump. That's why it has these brackets here. If your car has the LF30, the mounting brackets are going to look different. And actually, if you have an LF30 pump, I think your life is going to be easier because the rear mounting bracket attaches to this bolt hole already. So theoretically, you could just drill this hole out all the way if you have an LF30 pump and use your stock mounting bracket. Okay folks, the deed is done. The bolt hole is drilled and our mounting bolt fits in there nicely. So at this point, I think we can install this thing in the car. Okay folks, the M3 oil filter housing is in. And I also got a couple things hooked up off camera. So for example, we got this Vanos line routed nicely. Actually, I think that Vanos line has a leak in it, so I bought a new one. When that one arrives, we'll replace it with that, but we were able to use this one to get everything mocked up, get these hoses and wires and everything nice and happy. Also, I have both of my oil pressure sensors hooked up, the aftermarket one right here, and the stock one back there. We also have the power steering pump installed, or at least 2/3 of it. We still need to come up with a bracket for the back. Also, I'm not going to install the alternator yet because I need to extend this wiring. This is the oil temperature sensor. Once again, I'm putting that sensor down in the bottom of the oil pan, so we need to extend the wiring to reach down there. Oh, I almost forgot. If you're wondering what that third spacer is for the power steering pump, the smaller spacer, it goes right there. Okay, so next I want to take care of the oil temperature sensor. Now, if you remember, the M3 oil filter housing does not have a spot for the oil temperature sensor. So we're going to use this adapter to install the sensor in the bottom of the oil pan in place of the oil level sensor, which I don't use anyway. You can see the sensors already installed in there. I put some sealant on the threads, so hopefully it will not leak. But of course, since this is going to be in the bottom of the oil pan, we're going to have to extend that wiring pigtail. And that's what we've got here. I picked this up at the salvage yard earlier today off of another E46. So I should be able to just splice this in to that pigtail and we should be good to go. Here we go. Okay, so before we can install this into the oil pan, of course, we need to drain the oil out of the engine. Now, I just put fresh oil in the engine, so I got this container that I just cleaned out. We're going to drain the oil into that and then we're going to reuse it. I'm sure that will offend somebody, but whatever. Okay, so next we remove that guy. I wonder how much oil is going to leak out. We're about to find out. Okay, here we go. Oh, not bad at all. Okay folks, the oil level sensor is out and we're going to replace it with this guy. Now it comes with a new O-ring, so let's go ahead and put that on there and should be ready to install. Okay, so there it is. Now I forgot that these bolt holes are not evenly spaced, so this thing only installs one way. So if it feels like it doesn't want to go on, just rotate it until it does. Okay folks, it's been almost another week. Hashtag holiday season. Anyway, we got the wiring pigtail connected to the oil temperature sensor. And you may notice that I staggered the wire connections, so these will still fit inside a 1/4 inch wire conduit. Now after this is done, I'm going to route this stuff behind the intake manifold, down the side of the engine block, and down to the oil pan so it doesn't interfere with anything. Okay, now I've seen in another video somebody talked about these spacers need to be shortened for the LF20 pump in order to get the pulleys to all line up. So I'm going to double check that. I got a straight edge just a piece of angle aluminum. I'm going to place this on the front of the pulley and see if it lines up with the other pulleys. Alright, there's the crankshaft pulley. It seems to line up perfectly. The water pump pulley, I'd say it's within a millimeter. Should be good. Okay, I'm not sure what's up with that helicopter flying around, but I don't have all day to shoot videos, so sorry. Anyway, I mentioned earlier that these spacers for the power steering pump are just a little bit too long for the LF20 pump. They space the pulley a little bit too far forwards by about a 1/16 of an inch or 1.5 millimeter. So I'm going to shave about a 1/16 of an inch or about 1.5 millimeter off the length of these guys, and that should get the pulleys lined up just about perfect. Okay, so one of those spacers is done. Not sure how well you can see this on camera, but this guy is about a 1/16 of an inch shorter than that guy. In case you're wondering how I did that, I just used the bench grinder. I did it against the side of the bench grinder, or I should say I did it against the side of the grinding disc because the side of the disc is flat. So that gives us a nice flat surface. Now we just need to do the other one. Okay folks, both of the power steering pump spacers are now modified. Let's get these guys installed. Okay folks, we have the power steering pump reinstalled with our modified spacers, and the pulley alignment is just about perfect. Also, I went ahead and finished up the wiring pigtail for the oil temperature sensor so we can route that down to the oil pan. Okay guys, it's been almost a week since I last worked on the car because holiday season. But anyway, in the meantime, we got some new parts. So we have a new tensioner pulley to install on the M3 hydraulic tensioner, and we also have a new Vanos oil line. So I'm going to go ahead and install those parts really quick. We'll be back in a sec. Click, click. Torque to factory spec. Next on our to-do list will be to make a bracket. To secure the back of the power steering pump. Now I think what I'm going to do is have a bracket run from here down to this corner of this bracket. So basically it'll triangulate the whole thing. We'll see how that works out. Okay, so I took some measurements off of the power steering pump and I came up with a plan for a bracket to reinforce it. Of course, here and here are our two bolt holes that correspond to down there and over there. And of course the bracket will be folded here and there. So these will be lined up with bolt holes. Now let's test fit the paper version to make sure I actually have the dimensions correct. Then we can transfer this over to a piece of metal. Okay folks, we have our paper mock-up bracket installed and it fits perfectly. So now we're going to transfer that over to a piece of steel, and that will take care of the power steering pump mounting. Okay, so we traced our paper template onto a piece of metal. Now it's time to make our bracket. You may remember this vise in a previous video. We used this to make our custom mounting bracket for the GM transmission. So I figured we'll use the magic vise to make this bracket too. All we need to do is take this piece of metal and tap it onto the vise, and the vise will work its magic. So here we go. 1, 2. Hey, there we go. Looks a little rough. Maybe the vise needs a tune-up? Hey now. Anyway, let's get this guy installed and see if it fits. Okay folks, so here we have our little bracket installed. Once again, the purpose of the bracket is to triangulate the mounting of the power steering pump. So basically it'll keep the pump from wobbling back and forth like that. Anyway, I think now we can reinstall the alternator, and then we can start thinking about the oil cooler install. Okay guys, we got the alternator reinstalled, and so far so good. Okay folks, I think we have a Goldilocks situation here. I was trying to figure out the hose routing for the hose connections on our oil filter housing. You see these hoses that came with the oil cooler kit, they have a 90-degree on one end and a straight fitting on the other. First I tried the straight fittings connected on there, and they had the hoses come right out here and they hit the side of the air filter housing. So that's not going to work. Then I tried the 90-degree fittings, and they put the hoses right back into all this stuff. So that's not going to work. What we really need is something halfway between this and this. And that's where these come in. These are 45-degree fittings. Hopefully this will be the ticket. Okay guys, we have the 45-degree fittings installed, and I think this is our Goldilocks solution. This is going to route the hoses right into this empty area here, which is perfect. The hoses can go down here, and then they can loop around and follow the frame rail, and they can come out the front right about there. Okay, so off camera I removed the front bumper and the ductwork for the radiator there, so we can start figuring out the oil cooler placement, and of course we have a transmission cooler in the way. Unfortunately, when I installed the transmission cooler, I did not anticipate installing an engine oil cooler as well. So this guy needs to move over a little bit to make room for that guy, and I think I'm going to install it right in here. Okay folks, we skipped ahead a little bit, but I had to reposition the transmission oil cooler to make some room for the engine oil cooler. Basically I had to re-drill new mounting holes, and I had to shorten the pipes and the hoses too. I'm not covering this in much detail because technically it's not part of the oil cooler install. But for those who are curious, I had to use this guy to shorten the metal hoses a couple inches, and this guy to shorten the rubber hoses a little bit as well. Okay, so I'm at the point where I need to decide how to mount the engine oil cooler. Of course it's going in here, but I see two different ways I can install it. I can put it this way, which will look nicer, but part of this will be blocked off by the ductwork. Or I can put it this way, which will get more airflow, but of course it'll drive the OCD people crazy. So, what's more important to me? Making OCD people happy, or cooling my oil? Tough decision. Okay folks, it's been over a week since I last worked on the car. I don't remember exactly where I left off, but I had to relocate the transmission cooler to make some room for the engine oil cooler, which I'm going to put right in there. And to mount the oil cooler, I'm going to cut up a piece of scrap aluminum. This was actually left over from the racing seat install. It is 1" by 2" aluminum L bracket, 1/8 inch thick. We'll just slice it up to make a few angle brackets and should be good. By the way, the reason for the delay in the project is I had to order this guy to help make the whole thing work, and it took about a week. I'll show you that in a minute. Okay, fast forward a few minutes, and we have one of the brackets already test fitted here, and we also have the oil cooler test fitted on the front, so we can figure out where the bolt holes need to go in the other bracket. This stuff can be pretty tedious, but it needs to be done. Okay, we got the one bolt hole drilled. Now we're going to use our Sharpie, come up from underneath to mark those two mounting holes in the bracket, and we're home free. Okay, so we got the mounting brackets figured out, and yeah, I'm only using 2 brackets on the top. I realized that it would be optimal to have 2 on the bottom as well, but there's really no place to put them. So I'm going to try this out, see how it works, and if I need to, I'll have to figure out some way to make a bottom bracket. Anyway, I mentioned a minute ago about this fitting I had to order and had to wait for shipping. Let's talk about that. Okay, so on this side of the oil cooler, a 90-degree fitting should be fine. The hose will come across here, go down in this open space, and back to the engine. Over here is a different story. A 90-degree will have the hose going over here, and then I'll have to do like this crazy loop to get back down in there. Didn't want to deal with that. So I got this 150-degree fitting on Amazon, and it looks like it's gonna be perfect. And here we have it installed, so you can see it's going to aim the hose right at that open space, and I have space to access the mounting hardware. So, win-win. Okay, so just FYI, the mounting hardware that I'm using for the oil cooler is metric M5, and I'm using nylock nuts for a little bit of added safety. Alright, so there we have it. The oil cooler is installed, and actually it's pretty solid. Yeah, there's a little bit of flex to it, but nothing major. I mean, I'm not going to be playing bumper cars or anything, so it should be fine. Okay, anyway, on to the oil hoses. Okay, so we're skipping ahead a little bit here. I've been getting the oil hoses situated in the engine bay. As you can see, I've already got those 45-degree fittings installed on the hoses, and they're test fitted onto the oil filter housing. I've got those houses routed into this open space underneath the intake pipe or intake hose. They go down by the frame rail, behind that power steering hose, across the top of the steering rack, into this little spot below the sway bar, and out to the front of the car. So one of the hoses is going to connect here, and one of them will connect here. Now, unfortunately, I was only able to use one of the 90-degree fittings that came with the hoses. I was not able to use either of the straight fittings, so they're just extra. This 190 is going to be extra, and of course the hoses need to be cut to length. So I think it's safe to assume when you buy an oil cooler kit and it comes with oil hoses, you can assume that you'll be disassembling the fittings, cutting the hose to length, and reassembling. Oh, and in case you're wondering, I'm using one of these guys to cut the hoses, and I'm using an adjustable wrench with tape on the jaws to assemble the fittings. Also, I bought these AN line couplers on Amazon to help with routing the oil lines. Now, I'm not gonna lie, making custom hoses is a tedious process. You basically have to do it one fitting at a time. And in this case, I got the fittings on the oil filter housing done first. I got the hoses routed out to here. Then I figure out what I want the length to be out here. I cut them, and then I have to take it all apart so I can put these hoses in the vise and install the fittings on these ends. And then I get to reinstall it. So I'm not going to film any of that because it's super tedious, and we're just going to cut to these things installed. By the way, this pipe cutter actually makes pretty clean cuts on these guys. Basically, all I've got is just a little bit of fuzz right here that I can trim off with a pair of scissors. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that. Also noticed I used one of those couplers to help with the routing of the hoses. And this is the stuff we had left over. We're not going to be using any of that. Okay, we have one more thing to do, and that is mounting the power steering reservoir. Now, since I've got these oil lines coming across here, this one power steering hose, I decided to put it underneath them. I think a lot of people put it over the top, but if I do that, it's going to interfere with some of this stuff here. So it's a really tight fit down here, but it just barely fits. Anyway, we need to find some way to attach this to that, because this doesn't have any mounting points like the original. So here's my idea. Okay, so the idea is to use some of that L bracket material that I used earlier and make a couple mounting brackets for the power steering reservoir. We'll drill a hole in it, we'll bolt the reservoir to these, so we'll have one here and one over there. And then we will strap that whole contraption to the oil filter housing with a big old clamp. Alright, so here we have our two little mounting brackets. Once again, they're going to bolt to the power steering reservoir, and then this big old clamp is going to attach it to the oil filter housing. Let's see how that works out. Okay, so here we have those brackets installed, and also I'm test fitting the air filter box, and the good news is everything fits, although just barely. It's kind of tight in here, but it doesn't touch. But yeah, I think that's going to work. So at this point, basically all we have left to do is some clearancing on the side of this ductwork for the hoses, and put everything back together. And then we get to see how much those hoses leak. That'll be fun. Okay folks, we are almost done with this project. However, there's one last thing I want to do, and that is I want to get these oil lines up off the steering rack. So I'm going to make a bracket that attaches to the sway bar mounting point right here, and it's going to pull those lines up like that. Let me show you. Okay, so here's what I came up with. I took a piece of aluminum and bent it into a C shape, basically. This end is going to attach to the sway bar mounting point. This end has a really long screw going into one of those hose couplers. When I install this, of course, the hoses are going to go into here, and then the other side of the hose coupler will go on like that, and then I will secure the whole thing with a nylock nut, just like that. Okay folks, here we have our little bracket installed. Off camera I had to tweak it a little bit to make everything nice and happy, but look at all the space above the steering rack. Yes. Alright, now all we need to do is trim up the plastic pieces. So are we done? Now all we need to do is trim the plastic pieces to fit around all the new hoses and stuff, and this is done. So for example, on the radiator ductwork on this side, I had to cut out actually quite a lot to make room for these lines. Unfortunately, the mounting flange on this side had to go bye-bye. It'll be fine. And on this side, we also needed to trim away some material for clearance. Okay, so on the engine splash guard, I just had to cut a notch out of this one corner right behind the sway bar. Okay folks, off camera I reinstalled the front end and all the intake stuff, and I think she's ready to start up. Okay, not gonna lie, I'm pretty nervous. Cross your fingers. Okay. Take two. Oh, that's better. Alright, it runs, and I checked and I haven't found any leaks yet, so that's good. I'm in kind of a rush to get this video out by Christmas, so we're gonna have to end it here. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next year.